Welcome to Philosophy15. I am Robert Talisse, and this is my colleague,
Scott Aikin.
We are the authors together of this book, Why We Argue and How We Should, A Guide to Political Disagreement. This is a series of no more than 15-minute videos of Scott and I speaking without a script about philosophical issues. And today we wanted to talk a little bit about a familiar argument form called argument from analogy. How do arguments from analogy work? What are they?
Well, they work kind of like old friends. That's sort of a joke. So, hey, arguments by analogy are like friends.
Hey-o.
So arguments by analogy effectively take two things that you give a list of properties that they've got, you might say, in common. Then you list another property that one of the objects has, and then says, well, given this, all the other similarities that the two objects have got, we have reason to believe that one more property they've got in common. And so famous arguments from analogy in the history of philosophy have been, for example, Plato's Republic is run off of an argument by analogy, right? That the city and the soul, right, are supposed to work in parallel function. The justice of the city is like the justice of the soul, and so we have a list of properties that the justice of the city's got. The soul's got the same. The famous violinist cases, right? So the Judas Jarvis Thompson cases are ones that work on analogy. That having an unplanned pregnancy is kind of like being hooked up to a famous violinist to save that violinist's life. And so lots of arguments in philosophy run off of these analogies, or that beliefs are like assertions, or any of these sorts of things. And so we take the target object, or the target thing that we're theorizing. We make some inferences about it on the basis of something that you might say is more familiar and presumably less controversial. But that's kind of where things really start.
Right. Is the worry, so arguments from analogy, so think about the perhaps the most famous one that is the meat of Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion, right? So the watchmaker argument, right? This version of the argument for God's existence runs on the analogy between the cosmos, right? The universe, the world, being an intricate machine that's got lots of interlocking moving parts that seem to be moving, if not always in harmony, at least in some kind of coordination. And the thought is that looking around the world and denying, as the atheist does, that there is no intelligent creator of the world would be as foolish as the person would be who stumbled upon a watch on a beach and looked at the intricate workings of the mechanism in the watch and yet denied the existence of any intelligent creature that made the watch, right? So the thought is that the guy who denies the existence of the watchmaker on the basis of the empirical evidence of the workings of the watch would be obviously a fool. Similarly, that is, the analogy is, the atheist who looks at the world and denies that it is the product of some kind of intelligent creator, that person is also a fool.
Right.
Okay.
So sometimes the argumentative background, and so arguments from analogy, especially whenever they have surprising conclusions, look like they need to have arguments to the analogy.
Right. This is the right.
So in the Hume and the sort of the Paley's watch case is one that it looks like maybe the most controversial part of the argument from analogy is the analogy.
Right.
Right. And this is one of the places where, in some ways, and so push back on the Judith Jarvis Thompson violinist case. Often people say, well, the best way to reply to it is to break the analogies, to say,
right,
look, the more controversial element of this is the analogy. And the same thing might go with Plato's Republic, right? You might say one of the things where where one might say, yeah, the problem with the democratic person, the democratic soul, is that looks like it's that looks like there's a set of character flaws with the democratic soul, but that doesn't follow that there's a set of character flaws that happens with the democratic polis. And so sometimes arguments from analogy have got so they're supposed to start off with something relatively uncontroversial, a list of properties in common, but it looks like the analogy sometimes is actually the more controversial thing than, you might say, the target object of the argument.
Right, because an analogy is more than simply a list of common properties.
Right.
An analogy has to be the judgment that the common properties are indicative of some other commonality, or common relevant properties,
so
or constitutive properties.
They've got to be from the same domain, you might say. So, so one funny example is, in some ways, employees are like nails that without them things fall apart. But that's a good joke. But I got one better, nails work when you hit them on the head. So the crucial thing is that arguments by analogy require that things sort of be in some sort of the list of properties that they've got in common, and then the target more controversial property all kind of be in the same relevance class or same domain. If they're not in the same domain, you might say that's an easy way to break the analogy.
Right. So breaking the analogy is one way to go, right?
Right.
But I'm wondering if arguments from analogy in controversial cases, where one is trying to show one's interlocutor that on the basis of an analogy between two things, the interlocutor should accept some new claim about what's in dispute. So imagine, we're hearing a lot, by the way, on the news these days of arguments. We're hearing a lot of arguments from analogy with the current president and Richard Nixon.
Yes.
And so one of the ways those arguments run is they say, and when they run as criticisms of the current president, they'll say things like, Donald Trump has done exactly the same thing that Richard Nixon did, that is rightly condemned now by all properly informed, right-thinking, correctly thinking politicians. You condemn what Richard Nixon did in the Watergate case, so therefore you need to condemn what Donald Trump has done, or will be shown to have done, or is likely to be proven. It's likely that he'll be proved to have done. Now, I guess one of the concerns about arguments from analogy is that the strength of the analogy, or we might say not the strength of the analogy, but the relevance of the analogy, or the force of the analogy might be a better way to put it. The force of the analogy, maybe in these political cases, the force of the analogy depends upon how warm you are to the conclusion.
That's right.
Right?
Good.
That is, if you're willing to think that Trump is condemnable, then you will be moved by the analogy with Nixon.
Right. All the Nixon things.
Right.
Remember, before a lot of these scandals, the argument ad Hitlerum was
good.
Right. It was like all the Hitler analogies were ones that were sort of easy, were easy to see. Why? Because you were already kind of warm to this, well, he's kind of a populist. He talks like a fascist.
Right. He's anti-immigrant. Right. So I guess the concern about arguments from analogy is that within the dialectical contexts of trying to convince an interlocutor to adopt the conclusion, which is a new view about the subject or the thing to which the analogy is being made, right? Yes. That they're all going to be question begging when you're talking to an interlocutor who's not already primed,
right,
to regard, in the case that we're talking about now, Trump. Yeah. He's not already primed to think that Trump is condemnable. It's sort of like the argument for analogy doesn't give you reason to think that Trump is condemnable. It gives you a new thing to say about why he's condemnable.
Right.
So it doesn't, just like the argument in the Paley case, in the Hume-Paley case, doesn't give you a new reason. It doesn't give you reason to believe in God when there wasn't reason before. It gives you a new thing to say about why one should believe it.
That's right. That's right. It's more like making clear one's already standing evidence. It's a way. It might even call it a kind of an explanatory
or hortatory,
or maybe a heuristic.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Right. It's more like here's a way to see my view, or here's a way to inhabit my view, in that you situate it among a number of other similar kinds of judgments. And notice, by the way, that that there can be a kind of a backfire effect that can happen with these.
You Toland's
right?
it.
Yeah, right. So instead of Toland's it, I like that. Right, one person's modus ponens is another person's modus tollens. So if you see Donald Trump as analogous to Richard Nixon, and you've got the anti-Nixon thought, then it runs to Trump. But if you've got the pro-Trump line, then you say, well, then maybe Nixon wasn't so bad, right? And things like this happen all over the place in the history of philosophy. The one argument by analogy was the Lucretius parity of reasons argument. So all these parity of reasons arguments kind of have got this kind of defect or
vulnerability.
Vulnerability is maybe the better term, where it looks like. The Lucretius argument was, well, being dead is just like the time before you were alive, and you don't feel bad about the time before you were alive, but you feel bad about being dead. But if they're alike, you should feel the same way about them. And the Lucretius argument was, well, the more stable of the two is you not feeling bad about not being alive before you were born, and then you fix your attitudes about you not being alive after you die. But someone could just be saying, no, the more stable thing is me not wanting to be dead after death. And so as a consequence, I should regret or feel bad about not being alive before I was born. And so there could be a sort of a backfire effect in all these kind of parity of reasons cases. And notice, by the way, that argument from analogy kind of works from a presumption that there's a stable attitude on one side. Right, so arguments about same-sex marriage, for example, in favor of it, they run from you might say the wrongness of anti-miscegenation laws. Right. You say, okay, those laws are wrong. Laws that prevent gay marriage are like those, so they must be wrong, and that they presume that we've got that stable thought. And the same thing goes with arguments by analogy against gay marriage on analogy with polyamorous marriages, right? We're like, okay, it's got to presume that that's the case, but you might say, but those depend on people actually having really stable thoughts on the other side, and the thought could be, well, no, maybe the argument could run the other way. If people start making the analogy between gay marriage and polyamorous marriages, and someone says, no, the more stable thought is that gay marriage is okay, then that might go the other way.
But I'm wondering now if in the cases where things are really controversial,
yes,
right, and in the cases where you're where the interlocutor and you are opposed at the level of some important value commitment. The gay marriage case might be a good one. Yeah. The case about impeachment and the president might be another one.
That's a good one.
I'm just wondering if there's any clear or plausible sense in which an argument from analogy could at all succeed in these cases. I'm wondering if is there such a property as analogous to that's not already so deeply laden with one's value commitments, right, about what's relevant, about what's salient, right, that I wonder if arguments from analogy aren't always non-starters in the pinch.
Yeah, whenever the disagreement is particularly deep, arguments by analogy are going to be, at most, you preaching to the choir, or you
signaling,
nice signaling, or
signaling what side, who should ally with who,
or maybe just and maybe it could also just be a sort of a nice strategy of at the very least making clear what the view is. Again, so it's less argumentative and more explanatory or more heuristic, where you'd say, like, look, sometimes the analogy isn't out to convince you. Sometimes the analogy is out to just make it clear what the dialectical situation is. It's a kind of a clarifying view, or a clarifying. Presumably it takes the form of an argument, but maybe you might say it's a kind of a preparatory strategy.
You know what that means. Philosophy 15, folks. Thank you. See you next time.